Disinformation and outrageous or unlawful conduct emanating from the Trump White House every single day can be overwhelming. And we know this is partly by design, to keep Americans off balance, to divide them, and to prevent them from organizing effectively in opposition to the chaos and corruption. That's why it's important that we take a step back and look at the whole picture, that we see the forest and not just the individual trees, and look at what's going on and where we might need to pay attention. And that's the purpose of this hearing, to examine how the Trump administration is using the whole of government to silence or intimidate criticism and dissent in ways that go far beyond McCarthyism or the enemies list of the Nixon White House. And having identified the White House campaign to silence dissent, to discuss what Congress and Americans can do to fight back. The freedoms embodied in our First Amendment, the freedom of speech and religion, a free press, the freedom of association, and the right to petition the government for grievances, have always been central to the bold democratic experiment that is the United States of America. Our founders had direct experience with the importance of those freedoms and their necessity in a government of, by, and for the people, rather than one that operated at the whims or dictates of a king. Pennsylvania, and particularly the area that I represent, has always been at the forefront of that fight for freedoms. Over 300 years ago, the Quaker William Penn fled England and founded Pennsylvania, seeking religious liberty and more democratic forms of government. And over 250 years ago, the first Philadelphia lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, famously defended John Peter Zenger, a publisher who was jailed and prosecuted for libel after his newspaper exposed corruption by the colonial governor of New York. Debate and dissent have always been a driving force in our country, whether it was abolitionists working to end slavery, women struggling for the right to vote, civil rights activists fighting for the promise of democracy, people standing up to the Red Scare blacklists, or members of the press exposing the truth in the face of government corruption. Americans throughout history have exercised their rights to hold those in power accountable and spur our country forward toward that more perfect union promised by our Constitution. That's because Americans know that without being free to think, to believe, to speak as we want, there can never be real liberty for ourselves or anyone else. And the Trump administration knows that too. That's why, since Trump's second inauguration just over a year ago, this White House has pursued a whole-of-government campaign to silence opposing viewpoints. This campaign has included trying to stifle the free press by denying outlets access to the Pentagon, the White House, and Air Force One. It's included raiding a journalist's home, assaulting and arresting reporters, threatening networks' licenses to influence content, and literally defunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This White House has threatened to prosecute sitting members of Congress for sharing truthful information. It has deployed American troops and masked and armed federal agents to our city streets to shut down opposition, where they've threatened and even killed those who would hold them accountable. The administration is labeling people who disagree with the president's policies as domestic terrorists, putting their names on secret government lists and demanding that tech companies hand over the identities of Americans who organize or share their dissenting opinions online. This White House has unilaterally defunded programs and deployed government tools to suppress criticism and speech that this White House doesn't agree with, impacting comedians and late-night hosts, college campuses, law firms, judges, museums, children's libraries and books, nonprofit groups, and more. To this White House, free speech only means speech that it agrees with, and that's not okay. Freedom of speech, religion, press, assembly, and to petition our government, these are the constitutional pillars that our country was built upon, and they're values that continue to define our American way. But we can't take them for granted. If we want them to endure, we need to believe in them and fight for them. Americans as a whole have never tolerated political demagogues who use the power of government to punish their perceived enemies. It's exactly this kind of attempt to subvert our proud American traditions that's brought down other presidents and politicians, and I predict it will bring down this administration as well. Americans deserve the truth, they deserve accountability, and they deserve a government truly of the people, by the people, and for the people. Marshaling all of our resources to fight for the First Amendment, for our rights and freedoms, is how we make sure we get there. I look forward to hearing our witnesses' testimony today, and I'll yield back. So at this point, it's my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the full Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for joining us. I'm delighted to be here also with Ms. Jayapal and Mr. Garcia. Our numbers are a little bit diminished today only because of the snowstorm, which has affected some people's travel. But I want to thank everybody for continuing forward on this path and for your vision in calling the hearing, Congresswoman Scanlon. Alexei Navalny, in his book Patriot, says that to bring down the autocrats, everybody's got to do the one thing that they're most afraid of, which is to tell the truth every day, to debunk their lies and to expose the cruelty and the injustice of the regime. And it's a powerful point and a perceptive point because authoritarians detest freedom of speech. They do whatever they can to crush it because free expression is the essential threat to their power, their propaganda, and their platforming of injustice. We have never had a president more thoroughly determined than this one to stamp out the truth, to violate freedom of expression, to punish free assembly, to massacre the right to protest, or to destroy, manipulate, and shake down the press, the media. To be sure, other presidents have singled out political opposition or protests that they've wanted to repress. John Adams had his Alien and Sedition Act back in 1798, which they used to round up supporters of the French Revolution, dangerous French immigrants, and to stifle the pro-Jeffersonian press. Andrew Jackson deployed the Postmaster General to confiscate and criminalize the sending of anti-slavery newspapers and magazines and literature into the South before the Civil War, and he worked with pro-slavery forces in Congress to impose a gag rule against submission of anti-slavery petitions in blatant violation of the First Amendment clause favoring the right to petition for redress of grievances. President Nixon conducted harassment and surveillance against the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, people on his political enemies list, and he used the COINTEL program to try to disrupt opposition political movements. But no president ever transformed the entire machinery of the federal government into an instrument of political propaganda, censorship, and repression the way that Donald Trump has. As aspiring presidential dictators go, he is simply in a class by himself, which is why America now has a No Kings movement of tens of millions of Americans that has risen up to counter him. Trump makes no pretense of respecting any part of the First Amendment. He merges his insatiable greed and his authoritarian politics with his snarling dictatorial desire to stamp out any political, legislative, social, cultural, or intellectual expression that he personally disagrees with. The central purpose of the First Amendment is to safeguard speech, assembly, and protest for the purposes of democratic self-government and nonviolent change. But Trump and MAGA have built a masked paramilitary force in ICE and unleashed it, along with CBP agents, to harass, attack, arrest, and even kill Americans for exercising their First Amendment rights to record and protest government actions taking place in the public space. Unprovoked and unjustified, Trump's ICE soldiers shot down and killed in cold blood 2 U.S. citizens, Renee Good, a 37-year-old poet and mother of 3, and Alex Preddy, a VA ICU nurse, both of whom were peacefully observing and protesting the actions of federal immigration officers taking place on public streets in Minneapolis. Many others have died or been wounded in Stephen Miller's reign of terror against American communities. A young man protesting in California is permanently blind in one eye thanks to federal officers hurling a projectile towards him. An emergency room nurse in Oregon, peacefully protesting government violence, was hit in the face with a tear gas canister. Rather than investigate these murders and assaults on citizens, of course, the Trump DOJ defames the victims, calling them domestic terrorists and claiming they were going to assassinate ICE officials or otherwise were themselves at fault. Well, if they're willing to kill Americans for their speech, you know there's nothing else they won't do to us. They kicked off the authoritarian parade by issuing executive orders against law firms disfavored by Trump, purporting to ban their lawyers forever from federal contracts, federal employment, even federal buildings, including federal courthouses. These blatantly unconstitutional orders ultimately struck down on free speech, right to counsel, and due process grounds, succeeded in intimidating enough law firms to settle with Trump to gain him and his MAGA movement $1 billion worth of pro bono services for any causes or cases that Trump chooses. Again, nothing like this has ever happened in American history. He executed a parallel shakedown on colleges and universities, threatening their grants, their financial aid programs, and their student visas if they wouldn't allow Trump to take over their admissions processes, their faculty hiring, their curricular offerings and course content. This brutal assault on academic freedom has taken a huge toll on American universities and continues to this day. Meantime, Trump has engineered a new trademark shakedown of broadcast and media entities, suing them personally for millions or billions of dollars on totally frivolous grounds, and then using the Federal Communications Commission as a weapon and a cudgel to force their compliance and settlement of fines with the president. Trump sued 60 Minutes and CBS for $20 billion for the frivolous cause of action that he thought an interview, not with him, but with Kamala Harris, was edited, in Trump's view, too favorably towards her. And then he walked away with a cool $16 million in a shakedown settlement for his personal library, all part of now a familiar pattern. When he doesn't like the news, he sues the broadcaster and unleashes the FCC on them until they pay up and agree to have a pro-Trump MAGA government minder or spy stationed in their office. The Republican-controlled FCC essentially blackmailed media companies Skydance and Paramount into agreeing to install a spy to police CBS News to make sure that they're being sufficiently pro-Trump in order to get approval of a merger they wanted from the FCC. Donald Trump doesn't have a First Amendment bone in his body. He calls the free press the enemy of the people, when the press are the people's best friend. He calls reporters the most dishonest people ever created by God. During his first term, he threatened to change libel laws to make it easier for him to sue the media that publish unflattering pieces, though truthful, about him. The administration has banned news organizations from the White House press pool for reporting stories he doesn't like. And the FBI, astonishingly, just executed a search warrant at the home of a Washington Post reporter, seizing her phone, 2 laptops, and a smartwatch in connection with the case of a government contractor who was accused of taking home classified material. The administration has systematically deleted the use of politically incorrect words on government websites like diversity or equity or science-based, a completely Orwellian exercise in the censorship and manipulation of ordinary language. Trump has turned public schools run by the Department of Defense into political pawns of his censorship regime, banning books like To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee and The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini, or Native Son by Richard Wright, or George Orwell's 1984, or The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, for the curriculum which thousands of children of armed service members attend. Those books are no longer available to them. It never ceases to amaze me how they keep censoring books about censorship, like 1984 or The Handmaid's Tale. And And this administration has been waging a war on civil society groups, threatening to remove the tax-exempt status of organizations critical of his administration and issuing an executive order purporting to designate Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, despite the fact that they cannot identify its headquarters, its organizational structure, or its leadership. Well, of course, not designating the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, or a host of violent white supremacist groups. Well, all of these attacks on freedom, democracy, the rule of law, the right to assemble, the right to petition for redress of grievances, the right to free press, all of them have kick-started in an equal and opposite reaction. Millions of people are standing up for the freedom of speech across the country, for the rights of people to protest, for the rights of the press to do their jobs unimpeded and unintimidated. The people of Minneapolis have shown us the way by engaging in collective solidarity and mutual self-help to challenge authoritarianism, and millions of Americans have been participating in the No Kings protests across the country and are getting for another one coming up at the end of March. And an astounding 3 million people canceled their Disney and Hulu subscriptions after ABC, under pressure from Trump and his FCC chair, Brendan Carr, suspended Jimmy Kimmel Live in response to a joke, calling into question President Trump's views. The show returned to air a week after the suspension. So America's still a country that loves freedom and loves the First Amendment and is standing up for the First Amendment, and that, along with courts that are increasingly taking on the president, will be our way through this before we can get to the next election. I thank, again, Ms. Scanlon for organizing this, and thank our panelists for their participation, and I look forward to the dialogue today, and I yield back to you.
Thank you. So we welcome our panelists and thank them for participating in today's hearing. I'll now introduce each of the panelists, and after each introduction, we'll recognize that panelist for his or her oral testimony. Our first panelist is Rachel Goodman. Ms. Goodman co-leads Protect Democracy's Free Expression and the Right to Dissent team, working to protect speech and press freedom through litigation and other forms of advocacy. Rachel has developed and filed impact litigation for 15 years, including leading Protect Democracy's Law for Truth project. She earned a JD from NYU School of Law, where she was an Arthur Garfield Hayes Civil Liberties and Civil Rights Fellow and elected to Phi Beta Kappa, and she earned a BA with honors from Yale College. Ms. Goodman, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ranking Member Raskin, Ranking Member Scanlon, members of Congress, thank you for inviting me to speak on this important subject. I serve as Special Counsel and Free Expression Program Lead at Protect Democracy, where our mission is to prevent the United States from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. Modern authoritarianism consolidates power not by eliminating elections, but by tilting the playing field to ensure that the regime in power stays in power. Accordingly, we work to preserve Americans' ability to fairly compete for power through elections, which means maintaining the civic space to get informed, organize, and dissent. It is through that lens that we approach the Trump administration's attacks on the First Amendment. Aiming to quash dissent is a hallmark of the authoritarian playbook, the strategy through which modern autocrats have sought to erode democracy. Unlike democracies, autocratic regimes are threatened by the very existence of private spaces which can nurture dissent and incubate collective action. In my statement today, I'll describe some of the ways in which this administration has followed the playbook, aiming to push its political opposition off the playing field of public life. First, the administration has sought to undermine civil society organizations that it perceives as oppositional in order to entrench power. Presidential Memorandum NSPM 7, Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence, paints organizations on, quote, the left as part of a network of dangerous extremists and cites views on, quote, migration, race, and gender, among others, as worthy of suspicion. Although it is not clear precisely which organizations are being targeted in response to this directive, that uncertainty enhances its intimidating effect. This tactic echoes very closely that of authoritarian leaders in Russia, Hungary, Georgia, Slovakia, and beyond, who have legally disarmed civil society actors and other political opponents by labeling them as dangerous foreign agents. Second, the administration has conducted an extraordinary campaign of suppression aimed at silencing opposition to its mass deployment of federal forces in American cities. As we would expect to see in a healthy democracy in response to unpopular actions, Americans have exercised their First Amendment rights amid these deployments in a myriad of ways, using speech and signs, observing and recording law enforcement, and praying outside detention facilities, among others. This protected conduct has been met with innumerable unconstitutional uses of force, as federal courts in Chicago, Los Angeles, Portland, and Minneapolis have all held. DHS agents shot and killed not one, but two American citizens, Renee Good and Alex Priddy, who were exercising their First Amendment rights in Minneapolis this January. Subsequently, officers have suggested that observers should have, quote, learned their lesson from the killings. Officers have continued to intimidate observers by following them to their home addresses and have suggested that their information would be added to a domestic terrorism database. DHS also appears to have recently rescinded its Privacy Act memorandum preventing the creation of records describing how individuals exercise First Amendment rights. Using state threats and state violence to stop public demonstrations of dissent is a hallmark of authoritarian government. Russia's total crackdown on opposition to the invasion of Ukraine is one prime recent example. Third, the administration aggressively seeks to purge independent democracy depends on the courage of the American public. As the retreat of thousands of armed officers from Minneapolis demonstrates, that mighty force remains one to be reckoned with. I'm grateful for your attention to these matters, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Goodman. Our next panelist is Gabe Rottman. Mr. Rottman is the Vice President of Policy for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, leading the organization's work to advance key policy priorities like the Press Act and the Department of Justice News Media Guidelines. He's a practicing attorney with a focus on novel issues at the intersection of press freedom, news gathering, and technology. He has a joint honors BA from McGill University in Political Science and History and a law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center, where he was notes editor on the Georgetown Law Journal. Mr. Rottman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Raskin, Ranking Member Scanlon, and members of the committee for inviting me to appear today at the Spotlight hearing on the First Amendment. My name is Gabe Rottman, and I am the Vice President of Policy at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. Founded in 1970, the Reporters Committee is a nonprofit organization that provides free legal representation, amicus curiae support, and other legal resources, Amendment freedoms, and the news gathering rights of journalists. This includes a 24/7 legal hotline, and all of our resources are available at our website at rcfp.org. My understanding is that the impetus for this hearing is to review the emergent challenges to First Amendment freedoms, including press rights, in the approximately 13 months since the second Trump administration took office. While those challenges are severe and continue to escalate, it is crucial to bear in mind that many of the free press controversies over the past year have echoes of past actions by past administrations of both parties, which have also rightly been criticized by lawmakers of both parties. Perhaps the starkest illustration of this dynamic regarding threats to a free press today is the unprecedented raid on a Washington Post reporter's home last month in an Espionage Act leak investigation. That specific investigative step in a national security leak case, executing a search warrant in a reporter's residence and seizing many terabytes of electronic communications and data, effectively restraining the reporter from finishing stories in process, has not happened before. But stepped-up enforcement of the Espionage Act against journalistic sources has its origins in the George W. Bush, Obama, and first Trump administrations, with the Obama administration charging more media leakers under the Espionage Act than all other past presidencies combined, and with President Trump keeping pace with close to the same number of cases in just the 4 years of his first administration. We point this out not to excuse any of the second Trump administration's actions that threaten media freedom in the United States. Rather, we do so because it is crucial not to lose sight of the fact that journalists in the U.S. feel threatened because from one administration to the next over the last 2 decades, they have witnessed increasing encroachment on their news-gathering rights, with one exception being the Biden administration, during which Attorney General Merrick Garland barred the use of subpoenas, search warrants, and other tools against journalists acting within the scope of news-gathering. Those reforms were rescinded last year by Attorney General Pamela Bondi. In our written testimony, we provide more detail on 4 representative press freedom concerns today, which we see as federal priorities. First is the aforementioned execution of a search warrant at Washington Post reporter Hannon Nathanson's home in mid-January. Crucially, it appears in that case that the Justice Department may not have complied with a federal law meant to limit this type of investigative step. The effective seizure of a journalist's entire news-gathering and reporting toolkit is a significant escalation in the second Trump administration's efforts to intrude on press independence. Second, given numerous incidents involving the detention, arrest, or injury of journalists covering immigration enforcement operations over the last year, we urge Congress to ensure that DHS officers are all trained on best practices for interacting with press in the field, and that the department as a whole is subject to appropriate oversight and accountability. Third, we note multiple ongoing controversies at the Federal Communications Commission, where Chairman Brendan Carr has revived various rules and policies that can be deployed by regulators to police perceived bias by broadcasters, which poses an acute danger of the government attempting to put its thumb on the scale of public discourse. And fourth, we flag the administration's efforts to limit press access in ways that implicate the First Amendment, including the White House press pool and Pentagon credentialing matters, which are the subject of ongoing litigation by the Associated Press and the New York Times, respectively. Bipartisan efforts are needed to counter these threats and ensure the press can fulfill its constitutionally recognized watchdog role without interference from any administration. Fortunately, we've seen that bipartisan consensus over the past decade with, for instance, a federal reporter's privilege bill, Ranking Member Raskin's Press Act, passing the House without objection in 2 consecutive Congresses. Thank you again for inviting us to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rottman. Our next panelist is Bess Kalb. Ms. Kalb is an Emmy-nominated comedy writer and New York Times best-selling author of Buffalo Fluffalo, a series of children's books, and as well as the memoir Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. She wrote for 8 years for Jimmy Kimmel Live, for which she won a Writers Guild Award. She has written for the Emmy Awards, the Academy Awards, the Al Smith Dinner, and the 2020 Democratic National Convention. She is a contributor to The New Yorker and This American Life. Ms. Kalb, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Representative Scanlon, Ranking Member Raskin, the members of Congress here today. I'm honored to be here representing the millions of Americans who did not go to law school. So what am I doing here? I'm a comedy writer. I wrote for Jimmy Kimmel Live for 8 years, as Ranking Member Scanlon said, and I'm an author who recently got back from a national tour for my picture book series, Buffalo Fluffalo. So the fact that I am sitting here in a navy blue business suit in the Capitol building, surrounded by my esteemed co-panelists, at a hearing about the First Amendment means something has gone very, very wrong. I gotta say, I didn't see this coming. I thought we were entering a new golden age of free speech. On January 20th, 2025, President Trump, on his very first day in office for the second time, announced a presidential action called, quote, restoring freedom of speech and ending federal censorship, which was a big relief because I had some concerns about how he felt about speech he didn't much like. My first brush with this president happened in 2017. At the time, I was doing a recurring joke bit on Twitter before it was owned by the world's richest and most online man, Elon Musk. Every time the president free associated his feelings in all caps, I would reply as his concerned mom, sweetie, you're clearly having a lot of big thoughts all at once, you need to do your 5 deep breaths, etc. It was all fun and games, until one night, the president blocked me after I wrote a joke that hurt his feelings. I was confused at first and thought the account had mercifully been deleted, but it turned out that the man in the Oval Office couldn't take a joke and wanted to make sure he didn't have to hear one either. The Knight Foundation sued him to get him to unblock me and several others, without my involvement, though I thank them. The Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in New York ended up having to rule on this, and the Supreme Court took the issue up too. He quite literally made a federal case of a joke. The problem here is not that jokes bother this president. It's that he is in the habit of looking for ways to silence the joke tellers. I should tell you a little bit about one of my former jobs. When I wrote for Kimmel from 2012 through 2020, I was responsible for pitching about everyone, Democrats, Republicans, Kardashians. This was never supposed to be a job where I'd have to know anything more about the founding documents than an off-color joke about John Hancock. For late-night comedy writers, hi, Mom and Dad. For late-night comedy writers, the president is our best and worst audience. He is our best audience because, unlike most Americans, he watches late-night television. He cares about what the network men in suits say about him. He is our worst audience because his inexplicably bruised skin is very, very thin. He complained about our jokes frequently, often in real time, on his own social media site he invented so that nobody could make fun of him on it. This went far beyond social media tirades when this year, as Ranking Member Raskin mentioned, after Stephen Colbert told jokes about that $16 million settlement CBS personally paid to Trump, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was bulldozed like it was the East Wing of the White House. Then months later, emboldened by the Colbert precedent, the administration had Jimmy Kimmel Live briefly yanked off the air when the show's monologue displeased the president. I want to be fair. The Trump administration denies responsibility for these cancellations, much as the mafia is continuously surprised that so many people end up in the East River with cement blocks on their feet. But what we can say for sure is that this president that so prized free speech and so loathed censorship was positively giddy on Truth Social about the literal cancellation of these comedians. He was so excited, he misspelled the word canceled. The president wrote, "Great news for America. The ratings challenge Jimmy Kimmel show is canceled. Congratulations to ABC for finally having the courage to do what had to be done. Kimmel has zero talent and worse ratings than even Colbert, if that's possible. That leaves Jimmy, Fallon, and Seth, 2 total losers on fake news NBC. The ratings also horrible. Do it, NBC. President DJT." Then he got back to authorizing strikes against ISIS in Syria. To kill a late-night show doesn't just kill an enormous platform for speaking truth to power. Because late-night comedy doesn't just speak truth to power, it speaks truth to an incredibly large number of people. I believe late-night hosts like Colbert and Kimmel are vital satirists who shape how millions of Americans absorb the day's news. At 11:30 every weeknight, millions of people all over the country, just before their melatonin gummies hit, listen to what these comedians have to say about what happened in America that day. And under any administration, they are powerful voices of criticism and dissent. Network late-night hosts like Colbert and Kimmel have used their huge platforms to make tangible, incremental ideological change through satire, dressed up in a suit, in the hope that maybe someone who stayed up after the evening news on CBS or ABC will hear the news reflected back at them through a lens that is openly critical of the government, no matter who is in the Oval Office. And that can shape an electorate's opinion. And let's be clear, they're also doing interviews with The Bachelorette. But these permanent and temporary cancellations aren't just about controlling jokes. They're about controlling criticism of the administration and its corporate bedfellows. It is the state using its power to shape what is profitable to say. And we've learned nothing if not this. The bottom line comes first, even before the First Amendment. I have little doubt that CBS was in part compelled to end Colbert's show to avoid regulatory retaliation by the administration after CBS's parent company, Paramount, merged with Skydance Media, which I believe is a trust fund for one of the Ellison kids. And there is no doubt that this September's retribution against Jimmy Kimmel Live was due entirely to the host's criticism of our current president, despite the FCC's contention that it was for misinformation and sick jokes, which really just grabs me by the, I'm not going to say that in congressional testimony. There is no doubt that the president is so personally bothered by what comedians say that the FCC is willing to disappear any mouthpieces that might hurt his feelings in a shocking, and according to people with many more degrees and expertise than I, unconstitutional way. And here's how that trickles down. The censorship of free speech we have witnessed from the highest office in the federal government has emboldened Americans in sacred positions of power from the state to the local to the school board level, which is where I found myself just weeks after Kimmel's suspension. Talking about my brush with censorship this year might affect my broad appeal and livelihood as a children's book author, and I have not spoken publicly about this experience until right now in this room. But I have always said that if something is worth talking about with your family and closest friends and therapists, it is worth talking about with the ranking members of the House Judiciary Committee. The best part of being a children's book author is to actually read my books to children and to see them react and laugh and scrunch up their noses in delight, and to get the kind of uncensored feedback and questions that no comedy writer's room could possibly contrive. I was once asked if I thought I would win in a race with a buffalo. 2 years ago, when the first book came out, I was sent basically up and down the Amtrak Northeast Regional Corridor, but this year, after the books were a #1 New York Times bestseller, the publisher decided to put me on airplanes and bring Buffalo, Fluffalo, and Puffalo to the country. This fall, through partnerships between school districts and my publisher, I read to thousands and thousands of elementary school kids in small towns, in suburbs, in Kansas, Missouri, Texas, and Montana. In Montana, the tour hit a snag. The evening before a scheduled school visit in a rural community in a Title I school, the wonderful school librarian emailed me and my publisher, a group of parents who had previously caused a stir at a school board meeting where they successfully campaigned to ban certain books from the library, decided to ban me. They emailed the school superintendent en masse with jokes I had written in my life as a political comedy writer, and told the superintendent that if I came to read my book about prairie animals and their feelings to the kids, they would show up and make a scene in front of the children until I left. The visit was canceled. I should say, the kids they were threatening to do this to are around the same ages as my own 2 boys, who are 4 and 6.5, and are watching. And I love these kids in this school who had never had an author visit and had been reading the book with their teachers and making art projects about a buffalo and preparing very thoughtful questions for me would have shown up for a scary event where their parents barged in to the library and screamed at the lady in the dress, holding up a picture book and doing a buffalo voice. It isn't some great national tragedy that a story time was canceled, but it is a harrowing indication of how a joke can be wielded against its writer by exactly the same movement that railed against cancel culture to defend jokes that punched down. For the members of the United States Congress who haven't read Buffalo Fluffalo, someone who went to Kennedy School in your offices should have prepped you, but I'll summarize. The book is about a buffalo who is at first tough and blustery and rude and pushes his friends away. And then when it is revealed that underneath all his fluff, he is just a tiny, frightened guy who wants to be loved, his friends support him anyway. They love him just as he is. And he gives them gratitude and kindness right back. It's just left-wing commie propaganda. I believe that the impulse to censor free speech comes from exactly the fear in the book, the fear of being seen as weak or vulnerable, the fear of being seen as weak or vulnerable, the desire to project an air of bravado and to silence and push off anyone who might pull the curtain back on that image of imperious strongman. A true leader is only as strong as the joke he can take at his own expense. And there is nothing funny about the fact that we are living through a time when a joke about the government is a liability. In this room, surrounded by so many people who are as outraged and heartbroken by this administration's culture-shifting attack on free speech, I have hope. And I want to say thank you to the school librarians in red and blue and purple states whom I have had the genuine pleasure of meeting throughout my book tours, who are at the front lines of these school board fights over book bans with increasing regularity. They are tired, they are pissed, and they just want to be able to give a kid a book they're excited to read, even if the character in that book might have two moms, which as of this testimony is still a legal amount of moms to have. Because here's the thing about those kids across America that I met. From deeply underfunded Title I schools where most students were on free lunch, to immigrant communities where many of those kids were the first in their families to learn to read and speak English, to fancy schools in oil money suburbs where I was offered a choice of flat or sparkling water, I will tell you this, the kids were the same. The kids were the same. When I read my books in auditoriums and gyms and libraries and classrooms, some fidgeted, some daydreamed into Wonderland, but laughed and awed at the same parts. And when I asked if they had a question at the end, to a school, they all asked me the same one. Why is Buffalo Fluffalo mad? Why is he mad? And they also frequently told me the names of their dogs. I think we know why the Buffalo Fluffalo in the Oval Office is mad. But as I was saying before, I am hopeful because the members of Congress in this room today, like Representative Raskin and Representative Scanlon, who don't just posture and complain about this administration on social media, they are going to fight to stop the president from going unchecked in his vendettas against those who speak out against him. As a comedy writer and generally conflict-averse coward, I do believe that jokes can be an effective tool for speaking truth under authoritarianism. So I take comfort in the words of my fellow author J.D. Vance when he spoke last year at the Munich Security Conference, the funniest of all conferences. He said, "In Washington, there's a new sheriff in town, and under Donald Trump's leadership, we may disagree with your views, but we will fight to defend your right to offer them in the public square, agree or disagree." I'm not sure if anyone in the room can get the vice president a meeting with his boss, but that little whippersnapper from Yale has some ideas. Vance went on to the crowd in Germany. Now, within living memory of many of you in this room, the Cold War positioned defenders of democracy against much more tyrannical forces on this continent. And consider the side in that fight that censored dissidents, that closed churches, that canceled elections. Were they the good guys? Certainly not, and thank God they lost the Cold War. Thank God indeed, and may God continue to bless the United States. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kalb. Finally, we have Lee Rowland. Ms. Rowland is the Executive Director of the National Coalition Against Censorship. She has extensive experience as a litigator, lobbyist, and public speaker. She served as lead counsel in federal First Amendment cases involving public employee speech rights, the First Amendment rights of community advocates, government regulation of digital speech, and state secrecies surrounding the lethal injection process. Ms. Rowland is taught at NYU School of Law and the Hunter College Human Rights Program. She's a graduate of Middlebury College and Harvard Law School. Ms. Rowland, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, ranking members and members of the committee, and to the staff who helped make this hearing happen. Slightly less thanks for going back to a lawyer in a suit after the comedy writer, but I will do my best. I also want to thank my colleagues, the hardworking staff of the National Coalition Against Censorship, who helped compile this truly Herculean testimony, which I submitted in writing to the committee, even as their day jobs are busy defending free expression. The National Coalition Against Censorship, which I direct, is a 50-year-old organization. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit coalition of over 60 also nonprofit, nonpartisan groups banded together to defend the freedoms of thought, inquiry, and expression. Our two focus areas lie largely in fighting for youth-free expression and defending the independence of arts and cultural and civic institutions. As I noted, putting this testimony together felt like a Herculean task, even as I thought I was finalizing my overview of the harms that free expression has experienced over the past year. On Friday alone, there were 3 or 4 incidents that in normal times, which I do remember, would have been a 5-alarm fire for free expression. On Friday alone, Chairman Carr of the FCC used his bully pulpit to encourage all broadcasters within his regulatory jurisdiction only to air patriotic and pro-American content. This, of course, is coming from an FCC chairman who, as Ranking Member Raskin rightly noted, has used his power to go after, investigate, and alter the programming of media broadcasters that the president himself has called out for disfavor. In another incident, Mr. Rottman mentioned the seizure of records from a Washington Post reporter's home pursuant to a judicial signed subpoena. That judge excoriated the government on Friday after realizing that they had failed to flag for him shield laws that absolutely would have prohibited that subpoena from reaching those documents. And the judge rightly noted, we have ruined this reporter's career. That's irremediable. In a third incident that may not have made the national press, but which I want to talk about today, faculty at the University of North Texas's College of Visual Art and Design canceled a show by a visiting artist named Victor Quinones, who was grappling with concepts about basically his dual heritage involving both Mexico and growing up in the U.S., and had a show that had some anti-ICE themes. The entire show was canceled on orders from the UNT administration. And on Friday, transcripts of the faculty meeting were leaked to the media and reveal abject fear and confusion on behalf of a public school faculty unsure if they could display work with political themes. And that is not an exaggeration in the slightest. I'm sure you're all familiar with the analogy about a frog in a boiling pot, right? And these incidents on Friday alone are things that I would have thought would measurably bring up the temperature for censorship and propaganda in this country. And what I would like to use my time to really highlight for this committee is, in addition to the incredible amounts of direct censorship that my colleagues have focused on in their written and oral testimonies, if we are talking about the state of freedom of speech, it is in fact a freedom. And a freedom depends on whether or not you feel free to actually speak. And in addition to that direct censorship, we are currently witnessing a nationwide crisis of silent censorship, where people across the country have seen these incidents. They have seen protesters murdered on video for having the temerity to exercise their First Amendment rights to witness the government doing its job in public. They have watched as a media giant like CBS or a massive university like Columbia rolled over and complied in advance with the perceived political preferences of this administration. And that matters. When people's First Amendment rights are violated, I'm a First Amendment attorney. The courts are essential. They're necessary. They are absolutely not sufficient to actually uphold freedom of speech in this nation. There is no magical constitutional rights fairy, as much as I have wished for that every night of my life. For every teacher who was fired for posting something that somebody didn't like online, perhaps inadequately mourning the murder of Charlie Kirk. That teacher may be lucky enough to find a lawyer and file a First Amendment claim and maybe get some damages back, but there are hundreds of teachers within that district who know that that person has been fired, who know that if they speak out or say the wrong thing, they may lose their job, even their teaching certification, their librarian certification, and they choose not to speak. And that is a choice that no American should tangibly feel they have to make, and it is happening at a crisis level today. By any metric that includes the actual degree of freedom that people feel that they can speak, the water is boiling. I want to briefly mention 3 specific incidents that show this palpable fear at the local, state, and national level. At the national level, we have all seen the inglorious dissent of CBS in basically lending the president and the FCC authority to control its staffing and its programming. The FCC did not investigate or penalize CBS for airing an interview with State Senate Representative James Tallarico for violating the equal time rule. Instead, the FCC made its preferences clear. Chairman Carr repeatedly noted the kind of content he did not want to see online. He made amendments to the FCC's interpretation of the equal time rule that magically only applied to broadcasters that Trump has called out, rather than, for example, radio broadcasters under the FCC's jurisdiction who have a different partisan bent. CBS, which is not only, of course, directly regulated by the FCC, but currently interested in rather large media consolidation, is subject to the whims of the FCC's regulation and, again, has learned precisely what to do to comply in advance to avoid the scrutiny of the FCC or another investigation or another $10 billion or $20 billion lawsuit from the president that the FCC would assist in getting settled. That is complying in advance, and it was a choice. It is an unfair choice that no media should have to face. But that is the temperature and environment that we are living in right now, that even CBS rolled over in the street. At the state level, I commend to you to read the details of the leaked transcript from the University of North Texas discussion of whether or not political art can be shown at a school for art. That's a sentence I am tempted to repeat because it is so astonishing. It is a sentence that I certainly didn't think at this time last year would be something I would be saying as one more drop in the bucket of what's happened in the last week. During that conversation, the dean informed faculty that orders had come up from on high in the administration that an art show that they had invited and curated by a professional artist had been canceled. No explanation was given. It was mandated by UNT's administration. The faculty were instructed not to talk to anyone about that meeting's existence, not to speak to any students, to remember that they were always at the risk of being recorded when speaking to students. Ironically, of course, this meeting was in fact being transcribed and then leaked to the media. And the dean, who I don't mean to demonize, again, this is someone who should never be in this position, heartbreakingly recounts stories of administrators and faculty at other Texas universities who had been fired in response to controversy driven by hecklers' vetoes from partisan officials who dislike the content of arts or education presented at their schools. And the dean actually said to her faculty, things have really changed, and we are facing a different set of choices. And we have to choose whether or not we want to be here for the next generation of students. And in order to sustain ourselves, to exist, we have to alter our programming so as to avoid that government attention. And the faculty actually said, we're scared. We're worried for you. We're worried for us. What happens if our students have political themes in their artwork? And the dean said, again, to me, heartbreakingly, I don't know. Things have changed, and I hope that's something I'll be getting some more direction on when I speak to the administration about this censorship. And on the local level, and I will end with this, part of my job as an advocate is to engage in Know Your Rights trainings with the general public. We are sitting here about a month since Alex Priddy was publicly killed by DHS agents for monitoring actions of law enforcement agents, which he has every protected First Amendment right to do. But I feel like a fraud when I give a Know Your Rights talk and I am telling real people who are really at risk, who want to know, can I bring my kid to a protest? Can I take my phone out and take a picture of a car that I think is being driven by somebody in Border Patrol? How am I supposed to answer? Because on paper, the First Amendment says, hell yes. And in practice, we are living in a world where people are seeing the consequences of exercising those rights, and they are dire. They are not just losing your job. They are not just losing a certification. It may be losing your life. This has been a very rough year from a First Amendment point of view, so I just want to end, hopefully by pulling out of this nosedive just one iota, by saying there are things that we in this room, that we in civil society, that you as Congress members can do. The first, if you will forgive this very nonpartisan free expression take, is to remember that we are in a moment where norms are being violated and where federal power is being used to silence dissent. It is a good time to have that First Amendment lens on you when you are being presented with bill drafts that increase the government's ability to regulate or monitor free expression in any way. A good example is the Kids Online Safety Act, which has wide popularity among members of both parties and would give the government immense new powers to determine what content online would trigger age verification or content restriction. Now is not the time. Another thing is that censorship is deeply unpopular. When it is surfaced, when we talk about it, when we say this is the message the government didn't want you to hear, people want to see that speech. They want to hear it, right? Thank you for holding this hearing because it indicates that you get it, but part of it is shouting this from the skies. Do not let this censorship fall silently in a forest. Make a record, publicize it, use your platform, ask all the questions of DHS, and make sure you tell the public that you have asked them those questions, right? If they refuse to answer you, advocates like us, members of the public, government watchdogs, can follow up, and the electorate can hold them to account for refusing to engage with Congress. And finally, I'll echo the words of Ms. Goodman. We at the National Coalition Against Censorship have invested a lot in our advocacy to encourage people to engage in collective courage. Of all the tools of censorship and propaganda that have been wielded, perhaps none is a more hopeful story than the refusal of Harvard University to capitulate to this administration's demands to alter their curricular programming in response to claims of anti-Semitism by the federal executive. Schools like Columbia and many others agreed with the president's demands. I call out Columbia because they went as far as to cancel an entire Middle Eastern Studies department and put it in academic receivership. That is an absurd tinkering, right, of academic freedom by the federal government. But Harvard was the first university to stand up and say, absolutely not. And shortly after, numerous universities signed a collective defense pact. And of all the universities and colleges targeted by this administration, Harvard's the only one that hasn't paid tens of billions of dollars through the nose for the privilege of undermining their own academic mission. Courage matters, and public courage matters even more. So thank you to members of this committee for showing some of that courage today. I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Rowland, and thank you to all of our expert panelists. We'll now proceed with questions from this panel, and I'll begin by recognizing Mr. Raskin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Thank you for 4 awesome presentations to us. Very thought-provoking and I think very constructive for the American people to hear everything you guys are talking about. So I've got a quick question for each of you. Ms. Kalb, let me start with you. First of all, I'm tempted to start by quoting Attorney General Bondings and to say, you're not even a lawyer. You're not even a washed-up loser lawyer like me. Well, I wonder if you would delve more deeply into something that you touched on, which is the role of comedy and the comedians in this moment of political struggle and controversy, and why you think it's so important.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to your point, I didn't go to law school. I am not a real lawyer. I did go to a liberal arts university where I did a very moving dance about due process. And that's Brown for you. But I'll say this. Since the time of King Lear's Fool, the way to speak truth to power with a smile and get away with it has been comedy, has been satire. Since the American Revolution with Thomas Nast, cartoonist who made fun of King George. This is an enduring asset to democracy. And I think it can be a powerful tool for dissent. I believe in it. It's why I spent 8 years of my life, from tan suit to tantrums in the Oval Office, making fun of what became increasingly harrowing to make fun of. But to your question, I think comedy works. I think Ms. Goodman put it so well when it inspires, and Ms. Rowland, when it inspires collective consciousness to rise to action around the absurdity that is being pointed out. I think a good joke creates to give an unfunny comedic dissection of why comedy is comedy. It gives a cathartic moment of laughter because the truth has been said. Something that causes an involuntary response because it's so shocking and it's true. And so I think when truth is revealed through comedy, it can inspire exactly the kind of collective action that we need.
Yeah. It seems like, Donald Trump, who has no problem inciting a violent insurrection against the Union and the Constitution when he loses a presidential election by 7 million votes, cannot handle the tiny mental or emotional insurrection of a joke that crosses a boundary, and then he wants to crush it, again, using coercion and force to do it.
I believe it's because he's afraid of the truth in those jokes.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for everything you're doing with comedy, with humor, and with the kids. It's awesome.
Thank you for what you're doing for our republic.
And Ms. Rowland, let me come to you, and I agreed very much with everything you said, except I don't know that I would necessarily elevate Harvard above the people of Minneapolis, for example.
Nor would I.
As somebody who went there, I'm very proud of the fact that Harvard has stood up. It helps that it's got $19 billion at its disposal, and I would hope for nothing less than an institution that prides itself on intellectual freedom and academic freedom. But they've indeed been doing a very good job, and I thank you for saying that. But there is a regime of fear and intimidation and oppression around the country, and you can feel it, and people tell it to you. When you go out to a lot of campuses, people say professors are afraid to talk about certain subjects, students are afraid to talk about certain subjects, they're afraid they're going to be reported on, that there's going to be recriminations or reprisals for things they say. So for all of the worst fantasies and imagination that they had about political correctness in the classroom, this is that times 10,000, because the power of the state is there waiting for people. So I wonder if you would just elaborate a bit on what you think the best antidotes to that are. And I think that the ice is beginning to crack around the country around this. People are really beginning to speak out and speak up. The musicians, the comedians, the writers, the poets. But I wonder what you think is the key to sort of breaking the logjam.
Well, let me agree wholeheartedly. I'm also a graduate of Harvard, and I have no, frankly, excessive pride in my alma mater. I would absolutely agree that the people of Minneapolis have been a profile in courage for the rest of us to watch, right? And they've been doing it in sub-zero temperatures, which I think makes their constitutional fortitude all the more impressive. You are correct that Harvard has an endowment that allows it to cushion a fair bit of this kind of coercion and principle. But that is not unique to Harvard, right? That's partially why I called out CBS and Columbia. They, too, have massive amounts of money and still made a choice to comply in advance with unconstitutional demands.
And Paul Weiss-Rifkin also.
For sure. I mean, none of us even mentioned the attacks on law firms, and so thank you for raising it. I think collective courage is the answer. What we have to do is build among people in society a feeling of safety in numbers that starts to tilt that playing field. So even though all of us may not have $1 billion plus endowment, we do have community, right? And so, for example, after Harvard stood up publicly, many other universities joined in a collective pact, and we have not seen, right, another one of them fall prey to this since, even though they are much smaller than Harvard on average. In the philanthropy world, for example, John Palfrey, who leads the MacArthur Foundation, helped gather a group of philanthropists who said, we collectively, aware, by the way, of the threats of NSPM 7, which Ms. Goodman mentioned, said we are not going to comply in advance, and we are going to have an agreement among us as institutions that we will do it together. So no one feels I am the only one who's sticking my head up above, right, the whack-a-mole surface, and then I'm going to be the one targeted. And even on a more local level, at the National Coalition Against Censorship with our colleagues at the Vera List Center, we actually have a campaign called Collective Courage for arts and cultural workers to get together and sign on to a shared statement of values that said they will commit to their artistic independence and freedom, and make sure that they share resources and best practices and legal defense tips among them. So what we're trying to do is replicate that power of Harvard University on a distributed scale so that people feel that they are a member of a community that will support them. And if they are going to stand up and refuse to comply and insist on their constitutional rights, that they will be doing so in a community of like-minded people, which gives us safety. And not just safety, but also is a clear demonstration to other communities and to the international community that we are not accepting the violation of our First Amendment rights on our knees.
Great. All right, and then two quick questions. And Mr. Rottman, just for you, if you would say a little bit more about the Press Act, which I do have some pride in, and it has passed unanimously twice in the House, but if it had gotten through the Senate, what it might have done in the case of the Washington Post journalist. Ms. Okay, why don't you answer that, and I'll have a quick one for Ms. Goodman.
Thank you, Representative Raskin. So first of all, thank you for your leadership on the Press Act. And put simply, if the Press Act was in place, it likely would have blocked the Justice Department's ability to execute a search warrant at a reporter's home for the first time in U.S. history in a national security leak case.
Because it would create a journalistic privilege for reporters not to have to turn over their confidential notes.
Correct.
And that exists in most of the states, the vast majority of the states, but we don't have it at the federal level. Ms. Goodman, I wonder if you would reflect a bit on the use of the word terrorism, which appears in Orwell's 1984 and which is used by every good authoritarian all over the world, whether it's Putin or Orban. Their political opponents are by definition terrorists, and then that becomes the rubric under which they decide to investigate, prosecute, label, vilify, and demonize. And I wonder if you would say something about that and then give a bit of a legal analysis on what's wrong with that in terms of the way it's being used today.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Raskin. I think terrorism is a capacious term. It implies a lot of, obviously, fear and tactics. And there is a sense behind the term that there is some kind of truly evil ideology that comes along with it. And these tools have been lying around in the United States government since shortly after September 11th, this category of domestic terrorism. So those tools aren't new, but the notion that there is a specter of some sort of ideologically motivated threat that is looking to do violence to those who are inside the polity and who are sort of the good citizens, I think is a really powerful idea for authoritarians around the world. I think the key thing here that is in NSPM 7, and that is kind of at the core of this specter of domestic terrorism, is that it doesn't distinguish between kind of criminal activity or violence and protected speech and advocacy, right?
In fact, it conceals a lot of criminal violence like January 6th, which a lot of Republicans described as terrorism at the time.
Yeah,
I mean, that was real terrorism.
Absolutely. So I think, it's the chilling of the speech that feels like it could be related to criminal activity, even though, of course, the speech is protected, and that is at the core of the First Amendment.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I yield back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, and I'll recognize Representative Jayapal for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member Scanlon, for your leadership on this, and also Ranking Member Raskin for leading us forth on so many fronts. And thank you all for your testimony, Ms. Kalb. If you were to write for members of Congress, perhaps we'd have a bigger audience that would tune in for our very exciting hearings. But hopefully there's a lot of people that are listening to this because it really does affect so many of us in very profound ways. And as the ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee, I have been very focused on the ways in which the Trump administration has used nominally the immigration system to crack down on the freedoms and free speech rights and all the freedoms that people are guaranteed by the First Amendment, using immigration as sort of a catch-all phrase. I mean, this was supposed to be about going after the worst of the worst, and I think everybody understands now that this isn't about immigration at all. And I think what separates our democracy from authoritarian regimes is the freedoms that are guaranteed to every single person in our country, every single American certainly, and in many cases every single person, to criticize, to make fun of, to disagree with things that are said, and to do that with freedom. In fact, when the Republican majority had a hearing on First Amendment free speech protections, they brought people from other countries. It's the only time they've imported foreigners willingly to testify to us about Americans in those countries who were having their free speech rights violated. Meanwhile, there's nothing being done here at home with all the violations we're seeing. And so, obviously you've all mentioned the murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, and the full force of the government that's been deployed, including having the Secretary of Homeland Security, the President of the United States, label completely wrongly individuals like Ms. Good as a domestic terrorist, etc. So, Ms. Goodman, I'll come to you first. In addition to their killings, there have actually been hundreds of documented instances of federal law enforcement officers using force to suppress legal observers and protesters. I wanted to ask you if you could go through a few of those specific uses of force, and why so many federal judges across multiple states, not just Minnesota, that's what we're hearing about now, but Minneapolis, Portland, Chicago, have all found these tactics to be unconstitutional.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. So across the country, DHS agents have been using all kinds of physical and verbal intimidation tactics against protesters and observers, and this includes chemical munitions, right, pepper spray, tear gas, other so-called less lethal munitions. I can give just a few of the kind of most egregious examples, although, as you say, there are hundreds of them that have been submitted to courts around the country. So in Chicago, as part of a litigation that my organization was involved with, Reverend David Black was raising his arms in prayer outside the Broadview.
He testified at one of our hearings.
Oh, that's right, of course. And agents shot at him with exploding pellets of pepper spray, first from the roof and then at very close range, so he was completely soaked with pepper spray and left bruised. In Minneapolis, Susan Tincher, who is the lead plaintiff in that litigation, asked "Are you ICE?" while observing from a public sidewalk. And the response was that she was tackled, handcuffed, taken to the Whipple Detention Center where her wedding ring was cut off, shackled, and placed in a cell for several hours before being released without charge. And then in Portland, 84-year-old Lori Ekman was standing with a sign outside, this is Portland, Oregon. There have also obviously been issues in Portland, Maine. 84-year-old Lori Ekman was holding a sign outside the ICE detention facility. When she was shot in the head with a chemical munition, she left the scene covered in blood and was treated at the ER for a concussion. So I think these examples are so egregious. As you say, judges around the country have recognized them as violence that is in retaliation for the exercise of First Amendment rights. They've also recognized that the conduct is egregious and that DHS representations about that conduct are not credible before the court, and that this violence is, again, being deployed against Americans in order to suppress their exercise of First Amendment rights.
Yeah, they're lying.
Yeah.
Not just not credible, they're actually just lying outright about what's happening. What about advanced technologies like facial recognition? Senator Markey and I have a bill around this because we're finding that facial recognition software, license plate readers, these are all being utilized by the federal government, by DHS, to intimidate further, scan somebody's face who's a legal observer, and then send DHS agents, CBP or ICE agents, to that person's house to sit outside their house and say, "We know who you are, don't do this anymore."
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this collection and maintenance of biometric data and other data about folks is really part of the policy of intimidation here, right? They want people to know that domestic terrorism database exists and that their information is being maintained. So DHS is using technologies like the mobile Fortify app to do facial recognition and match people's faces with their names and biographical info. This license plate reader technology that you mentioned, which has vehicle movement data, social media activity, addresses, phone numbers attached to it, and is enabling this really terrifying thing, right, where law enforcement are showing up at people's houses where they may have children or other, elderly relatives they take care of, and really chilling and intimidating their speech intentionally. So I think this is kind of another way that the maintaining of this database, domestic terrorism database, and telling people about it is a way of treating political dissent, as we were discussing, as a criminal conspiracy. And I'd also just like to note that my organization filed litigation in Portland, Maine this morning that's challenging these tactics in particular.
Yeah. Mr. Rottman, I want to talk about journalists because you were talking about the Washington Post case. This is another way in which in Minneapolis and in places around the country, journalists are also getting arrested just for doing their job and reporting on ICE's abuses. In Minneapolis, Trump's DOJ has brought criminal charges against journalists Don Lemon and Georgia Fort for reporting on a protest at a church, and your organization provides pro bono legal services, I know, to journalists across the country. Have you ever seen a prosecution like this? And what does it signal to journalists who are trying to actually cover these abuses of ICE and CBP across the country?
So the short answer is no. We haven't seen a prosecution like the Lemon and Fort case. It is a dramatic overcharge. There's no reason it should be a federal case. In the cases we've seen where journalists follow individuals on a private property as part of protest activity, in virtually every one of those cases, charges aren't brought. When charges are brought, they're dropped. And in the handful of cases that we've seen where the case goes to trial, the journalists are almost always acquitted at trial. So to make a federal case under the FACE Act and under Section 241, effectively a federal civil rights case out of this is both unprecedented and extremely troubling.
I really appreciate all of your testimony, and there's so much to cover on this topic. I decided to just focus on immigration, but I will say to your point, Ms. Rowland, that courage is contagious, and I think that is part of what we have to train Americans across the country to recognize, is that it is a fearful time, but courage is acting when you're afraid, not when there's an absence of fear, and that is, I think, what we need every American to be doing right now in whatever way they can. Thank you all so much for your work. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. And I would now recognize Representative Ballant for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Representative Scanlon. You and Ranking Member Raskin are such champions on these issues. I'm very delighted to be able to share the dais up here with all of you. I know that we all work so well together, and just such a delight to hear from all of you as well. Thank you for your time. And I wanted to just start by talking about something that you touched on, Ms. Kalb, when you were talking. As a former teacher myself, I taught history and social studies for years. Librarians are the heart of every single school, and they are the freedom fighters. And I'm so glad that you talked about that, because I know in speaking with librarians in my home state of Vermont, they are afraid, but they're still fighting the fight every day. So very much appreciate that you brought that into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for your work in the United States Congress and in history classrooms. It's where I form my political consciousness.
Yeah.
And librarians are the people with whom I had lunch in elementary school.
That's right.
So,
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
They're one librarian in particular in Pennsylvania, I sort of referred to a purple state. This librarian is the one who goes up against Moms for Liberty, other organizations.
That's right.
Where people are trying to ban books. And she's really the person who stops them.
Exactly.
So
well, thank you.
They are courageous in a time when that's difficult.
Absolutely. And I wanted to just state the obvious. We know it, but I think it's really important to ground us in this, is that Trump does not respect the rule of law. Can we all just start from that basics place? And he certainly doesn't care about protecting our First Amendment rights. And we've all touched on it in some way already in this hearing, that you have an authoritarian pattern that is so clear here. His administration targets a group, attacks constitutional rights, then uses whatever legal authority that they can get away with. That's basically the standard right now, whatever we can get away with. Then they use that to amass more power, consolidate more power, and then use that then to attack others, right? When you all spoke about that so eloquently. And one of the things that I've been thinking about so much is the ways in which Trump's first actions in the early days of administration was going after, a full-scale crackdown on immigrants' free speech rights, right, to use them as examples. And the Department of Homeland Security detained foreign students who were here legally because of what students said about the war between Israel and the people of Gaza. And those people included Mahmoud Khalil, a student at Columbia University, Ramesa Ozturk, a Tufts University PhD student who is here on a student visa. And I should say Mahmoud Khalil was also here legally. And then my constituent, Mosa Madawi, also a Columbia University student and a Vermonter for over a decade, who was literally one step away from being a naturalized citizen. He was called in for a bogus hearing, and at that hearing, that's when he was arrested. And he will actually be my guest tomorrow for our alternative programming for State of the Union. But so each of them was detained and arrested under circumstances that were frightening. And I want to highlight the situation with Ramesa Ozturk. She was abducted off of the streets by masked men and literally thought she was being kidnapped. And in fact, it turned out she was, but only by our government. That was the unexpected part. And I already spoke about how Mosa Madawi was arrested. And I wanted to ask Ms. Goodman, it looks to me like these arrests are actually very calculated in the way that they're carried out, because it's not just about intimidating them. It's about sending a message to others that, in fact, you need to not use your First Amendment rights. Would you agree with that characterization?
I think that's right. And I think it is impossible, even with the might of the federal government, as Ms. Rowland was discussing, to actually suppress the speech of the many millions of Americans who disagree on something, right, with this administration. I think even among the population who voted for Donald Trump, there are many things that people disagree with the administration on. And so these performative acts of speech suppression are calculated to make people afraid and make them engage in self-censorship to sort of spare the government the trouble. And I think you're exactly right that out of the gate, the demonstration of that force and that sort of disregard for the norms of government in a modern due process respecting democracy were discarded to make everyone feel afraid about that.
And so when you have the chilling effect as baked in to the strategy, how do we as Americans counteract that? And you've talked about it, all of you, about courage needs to be collective. We need to draw on each other's strength. But what other things would you say to Americans right now in this moment that would help to counteract that chilling effect?
I think collective action is such a big part of that, and part of collective action is also being unafraid to talk about the unpopularity of the autocrat, right?
Yes.
As I think the notion that they have all the force and all the support, and you are a tiny person who is going to be crushed, by the might of the state, is the illusion that the autocrat wants to project. And not only is sort of banding together a big part of it, but also saying out loud, this particular president has historically low approval ratings.
Yes.
And I think that's important to make clear when people are feeling afraid. There are also, I know Mr. Rottman would agree that supporting independent media is a really big part of what we can do in and any other independent institution that is maintaining dissenting narratives amid all this suppression. I think the boycott of Disney was quite powerful in causing that corporation to change its calculus. So all of these ways that as consumers, as workers, as speakers, we can resist together, I think are important.
Thank you for that. I think Americans across this country are looking for any opportunity to feel like they can push back. And as we talked about, we've seen in Minnesota, we've seen also in Chicago and in Los Angeles and in Portland. And I know that my time is up, and it's very difficult because there's so many other things I wanted to get into. But I will just say thank you for all that you're doing on the front lines, because it's going to take people in comedy. It's going to take people who are out in the field working with people. It's going to take all of our collective action. So really appreciate your time. I yield back.
Thank you so much. And now I would recognize Representative Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Members Raskin and Scanlon, for this convening, which affects everyone in our country, and of course the issue of free speech, because the Trump administration's assault on the freedom of speech and dissent has to be pushed back, rolled back, rejected. Authoritarians like Trump know their policies are deeply unpopular, so they depend on the suppression of speech and dissent to violently assert their fascist agenda. And that's why, as Trump has become one of the most unpopular presidents in history, he has escalated his campaign of repression against our communities. Communities in Chicagoland, I speak from personal knowledge. My colleagues have already spoken about several ways in which this administration is trying to destroy the First Amendment and our civil liberties. Book bans, NSPM 7, attacks on the media, and of course targeting colleges and universities. All of this is a part of a multi-pronged assault on democracy and freedom. So too is the weaponization of the immigration system to suppress free speech and dissent. From the start of this administration, we've seen how our immigration system is being used to target people based on their views. They've targeted legal permanent residents who spoke out against the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. Mahmoud Khalil, whom I met with last week, Mohsen Magdawi, Rumeysa Asirk, Badar Khan Suri, and many others who were targeted for removal based on their speech and identity, and all of them here legally. They've made viewpoint discrimination a core part of immigration vetting process. DHS is scrapping social media accounts to find people who've criticized this administration or foreign governments like Israel, or revoked or refused to issue visas. This campaign of mass surveillance has targeted anyone who speaks out against this administration, not just immigrants. Just last week, we saw the news that DHS is forcing social media companies to turn over information about who is running accounts that are critical of ICE. And of course, they violently suppress protests by Americans who are standing up against DHS's reign and state-sponsored terror. They murder protesters like Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good, tear gas and pepper spray protesters and journalists, including children in my district, as well as outside facilities like Broadview Processing Center just outside Chicago. And they even bring criminal charges against protesters like the Broadview Six. My State of the Union guest tomorrow is someone who was shot 5 times by ICE and CBP agents. She survived, and she's pushing back, and she wants people to know what happened, and she wants all of the evidence that was used to make felonious charges and false charges against her public. This is all part of their campaign to silence protest and dissent against their violent authoritarian agenda, which DHS is enforcing through brutality against citizens and immigrants alike. Thank you all of the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Goodman, do you believe that the Trump administration's weaponization of the immigration system makes our democracy more or less safe?
I think it makes our democracy less safe. I think it's clear that part of this administration's agenda is to use the DHS law enforcement forces as a speech suppression tool, as we've seen in so many ways, and to make people afraid, not only immigrants or people in immigrant communities or share households with immigrants, but more broadly to make people really afraid of engaging civically at all. And I do think that is a real intention.
Thank you. And Ms. Goodman, how does this weaponization affect not only immigrants, but every person in this country?
We all hold these rights in some substantial way as collective rights. As Ms. Rowland was describing earlier, the culture of free speech is really mutually reinforcing, and we don't, when particular individuals or particular communities or particular viewpoints are targeted for speech suppression, that sends the message that dissent generally is dangerous and impoverishes our discourse.
Thank you for that. And that's why it's going to be so important that when Democrats take power, that we enact legislation that protects nonviolent protesters and prohibits viewpoint discrimination. Because after all, we live in not normal times, and it requires for ordinary people to engage in extraordinary efforts to reestablish democracy and freedom of speech for everyone in our country. Thank you all for being here today. I yield back.
Thank you. And at this point, I would recognize Representative Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Congresswoman Scanlon, and thank you, witnesses, for your appearance today. I'm sorry for getting here late, but better late than never. The Trump administration is coming after our neighbors and attacking civil society, and Americans have responded by taking it to the streets and exercising in a nonviolent way our First Amendment rights. But an engaged and informed citizenry scares the hell out of the Trump administration And so they have responded by physically attacking and assaulting peaceful protesters. And these Department of Homeland Security, ICE, and Customs and Border Patrol thugs are the ones who've been doing this work. Their ranks have been plussed up double, 10,000 new agents with the passage of the big ugly bill, and with $170 billion for that agency to use as it militarizes the streets of America with these armed thugs. Now, these are folks that can't invest in uniforms, but they can, according to the report just issued by Senator Adam Schiff, they can be equipped with modern battlefield weaponry. This is what they are doing. They are spending quadruple the amount of money this year on military armaments for ICE and CBP officers than they spent in all of the previous year. So 360% increase. I forget the amount of the figure. It was like maybe $400 million going to purchase arms that are now being deployed by officers. These guys don't have uniforms. You know, you look at a picture, you can see a guy in tennis shoes and jeans next to somebody else who's got camouflage on, and somebody else who's got some other type of jeans on, and they all have these military helmets, the flak jackets. They have the cans of riot, what do you call that stuff? That they sprayed into Alex Pretty's face. And spraying into the faces of everybody who gets near them. They have cans of that, dispensers, they have 9mm, they have assault weapons, they have helmets, they have flak jackets, and they are ill-trained, and many of them, we don't know who they are, but I suspect, since they're being recruited over racist advertising in on far-right platforms, that's the kind of people that they are attracting, misfits from society, equipped to the hilt with military-style weapons, patrolling our neighborhoods, stopping people, pulling them out of cars. And now we hear the administration talking about using armed agents in the upcoming elections. Elections, there's no right to vote in the Constitution. So you got to assume, though, that that right to vote is a way of communicating. That's a First Amendment right. You're speaking through your vote, but they want to suppress that. Ms. Goodman, within the last few months, your organization has filed at least one lawsuit against DHS and federal agencies for violating individuals' constitutional rights. Your organization also works to protect elections, including protecting voters' ability to participate meaningfully in the process, free from intimidation and harassment. I'm concerned about the confluence of these two things. We are seeing an increased presence of military law enforcement in our neighborhoods, and now we know that the midterm elections are approaching, and the Trump administration has said that they are going to deploy armed thugs and misfits around our polling places. If they are deployed, or if more are surged onto our streets in the fall, do you worry that these ill-trained, armed, military-style militia types will pose a threat to the freedom of speech as exercised by voting?
Thank you, Congressman Johnson. I do worry about that. I think the administration it is trying to tilt the electoral playing field in all the ways that it can, and these speech suppression efforts are part of that. These deployments to cities are part of that, an attempt to make people more used to the idea, as you say, of armed militarized forces on the streets representing the federal government and intimidating folks. I think the administration's goal is to disable true competition in the elections, and it is prepared to do that in a variety of ways. As we've been discussing, I think, self-censorship is still a big part of that. So Americans need to know that you have the right to vote. And I hope and expect that in the ways that we've seen people in Minneapolis come together to protect their rights in response to these deployments, we'll see those kinds of coalitions and mutual aid organizations arising to help make people feel empowered to cast their ballots, even amid any of the kinds of tactics you're alluding to.
Thank you. Trump's Department of Homeland Security has used white nationalist and anti-immigrant images and slogans in its recruitment materials. Its recruitment images feature white people almost exclusively, while DHS's social media disproportionately posts images of black and brown people accused of violating federal laws. Do you think that their presence at the polls will particularly impact black and brown people's freedom of speech as they exercise it by voting?
I think we can expect to see that the places these troops and forces will be deployed are places where the administration expects the vote share and the communities would be voting for its opposition, and it certainly is afraid of the voting power of black and brown communities. I think, as you say, this idea of delegitimizing certain communities is a core part not only of the Trump administration's playbook, but of the autocrats' playbook internationally. And I do expect they will continue to use that playbook in an attempt to tilt the electoral playing field.
Thank you. Well, again, I appreciate you all's viewpoints. Thank you for coming today. I saw Congresswoman Scanlon, but I did not see Congressman Raskin, the ranking member. So I want to thank him also for you too for putting this very important hearing together. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you so much. Now, I hesitate to do this with a comedy writer in the room, but I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Goodman, in your testimony, you discussed the Trump administration's attempt to blur the lines between free speech and actual crimes through its directive known as NSPM 7. The president issued this back in September. I tried to discuss this directive with Attorney General Bondi last week, but she wasn't terribly forthcoming. But I was asking questions of her because in December, she issued a directive for the Department of Justice to compile a list of organizations whose members might be engaged in what this administration calls domestic terrorism, and which, as you noted, has a very expansive definition, which could include, anyone who goes to a No Kings March, et cetera. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this directive, which has a focus on dismantling groups that may oppose White House policies, can intimidate or silence political opposition, and why every American should be concerned?
Thanks, Ranking Member Scanlon. I think the language in NSPM 7 and in Attorney General Bondi's implementing memorandum is incredibly broad, right? Indicia of extremism include anti-fascism, anti-Christianity, and hostility toward, quote, traditional American views on family, religion, and morality. And Attorney General Bondi's implementing memorandum identifies doxing and impeding immigration enforcement as equivalent to providing material support for terrorism, which I can't even sort of understand logically. I think the idea is to inhibit collective action, which we've been talking about a lot today, and by sort of targeting the civil society organizations through which Americans band together to express political preferences and speak and engage in elections, among other things. the chill is just quite there. But as Ms. Rowland mentioned with respect to philanthropy, a lot of nonprofit organizations have also formed this NGO solidarity network to kind of come together and resist. And I think civil society is not going down without a fight. And even though NSPM 7 has led to, I think, some chilling effects of organizations, and we're now seeing in the invocation of domestic terrorism in response to the killings of Alex Priddy and Renee Good, the sort of poisoning of the discourse up and down by NSPM 7, I think there is good collective solidarity in response to that memo.
Yeah, I thought as we've been researching NSPM 7, I was really struck by the fact that several major law firms issued guidance highlighting the fact that it could be used to silence NGOs, nonprofit organizations, by going after their tax status. You mentioned the term impeding law enforcement. This is something, I think CNN did a piece about it over the weekend, that all of a sudden this administration, DHS, seems to have embraced the idea that if you film ICE officers or Customs and Border Patrol, or if you follow a car, that is somehow impeding them, and therefore they are charging people with impeding, although they seem to drop it if they have to actually try to prove it in court. Can you comment a little bit on this rise in the use of impeding law enforcement as a way to silence dissent?
I can't believe that we've gotten this far in today's conversation without talking about the retaliatory use of the criminal system, which has been part and parcel of these deployments. But the Department of Justice seems to be adopting the view that, despite the fact that courts have said over and over that observing and recording law enforcement is protected First Amendment activity, that somehow that activity is a crime under federal law. The good news is that these prosecutions are going nowhere. They are getting dropped in ways that are humiliating for the Department of Justice when discovery comes out in these cases. When they go to grand juries, grand jurors around the country are rejecting them in ways that grand jurors have never rejected really anything before from the federal government. So I think there is some real reason for hope that the criminal system, although it is a terrifying threat for the administration to deploy, unlike many of these other regulatory threats that they can keep out of court and thus keep really scary, our courts are really holding, and I think that is impeding the ability to use that impeding charge in that way.
Thank you. Mr. Rottman, you mentioned something that I thought was interesting about the need for more training for DHS and other federal agents to have training in how to interact with the press. Can you tell us why there's that concern and what that might involve?
Absolutely. So the concern is from both anecdotally and the high-profile instances that we've seen recorded on video where journalists have come in the middle of protesters and DHS agents. And it's crucially, part of the concern is that the Department of Justice, because of the nature of its mission, has had a long-standing institutional culture of interacting with journalists. For instance, the Justice Department, even though they were weakened under Attorney General Bondi, still has policies in place that limit the ability of departmental investigators and prosecutors to get information from journalists. And so it's really baked into the culture. And with DHS, there's a concern that because its mission is more focused, it has had less opportunity to create that institutional culture. And so we at the Reporters Committee have asked the department for a meeting precisely because we think it's crucially important that the department comprehensively train all of its agents and all components of DHS on how to interact with journalists. And for instance, one policy, we train both newsrooms and law enforcement around the country at all levels on best practices for interacting with journalists. One of those, we call it arrest avoidance. If a journalist is detained, even if there's reason for that detention, it's dark, it's difficult to tell who's who, that as soon as that person says, I'm press, the officer is trained to let them establish their status as a journalist, let them go, let them continue to report, right? So there is that independent documentation of the protest activity. And so we've asked DHS to implement training on that and other similar policies that would limit negative interactions between officers and journalists. We haven't heard anything back. The last we heard was the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, Richard McLaughlin, was asked about our letter and another from news organizations in New York. And effectively she said that we take all precautions, but journalists should be careful when covering immigration enforcement activities, which respectfully I think is the wrong message to show. Journalists have a right to be there, they have a right to record, and DHS officers need to be trained to a person to respect those rights.
Right, and just recognizing the fundamental importance of the free press and the ability to inform the public, as you said, baking that into these processes. Ms. Kalb, you have talked a little bit about the unique role of humor in exposing corruption and hypocrisy, and I was struck by something you said about humor or a laugh being when truth is exposed through comedy. And I couldn't help but think about the power of the inflatable dancing frogs that we've seen at a number of these protests to counter these fake White House claims that opposition to its policies is being led by violent radicals. Can you just speak a little bit about humor in that context?
I think the humor is coming from the absurdity of the claims. The humor is delivered to the protesters. It's underlining exactly what Ms. Goodman said, which is the unpopularity, the lack of public support for this president is reflected in how quickly and deftly and hilariously protesters can point out the truth, which is that there is no grand left-wing conspiracy Antifa meeting underground. What's happening underground and is actually, any nefarious anti-governmental conduct is happening in the Oval Office. This is deputized by the administration itself. And so I think comedy is, I also want to be clear. I think that it's nice to have comic relief, but of course the real work that is being done are by the legal defenses, the representatives who are making sure that protesters have every right to dress up as silly frogs and make their points and reveal the truth without meeting the same fates of Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good and others. And so I think, yes, may there be more dancing frogs, and may the people here do the work to keep them dancing.
Thank you. Sort of to that same point, one of the challenges has been the amount of disinformation coming from the administration and this idea that there's some vast left-wing conspiracy. But Ms. Rowland, you've talked a little bit about civil society, the pillars of civil society, and how important it is that people don't self-silence. I mean, as someone who worked as pro bono counsel for a large law firm for 15 years, it was really, really distressing to see major law firms roll over when confronted by this administration, and even more distressing when we saw that those firms that did stand up very quickly had their First Amendment rights vindicated. But so can you just talk a little bit about the collective action that we would like to see from law firms and media and universities? I think labor unions and faith groups have been doing the best job at standing up so far.
I agree with you. I think civil society has shown real backbone. I'm glad that Ms. Goodman mentioned that NGOs and civil society are also coalescing around this. I think, Ms. Kalb just said, it's the lawyers who are doing the real work to defend the frog's right to be on the street. That's half true, right? But if it weren't for people out living expressive lives, First Amendment attorneys would have nothing to defend, right? We defend it in principle, and people raise their voices in practice, right? And that's the kind of beauty of our democracy. So I think it is, you're absolutely right to call out those groups in civil society, and I think I'm, however, going to resist the urge to appeal to the better angels of corporate nature and actually say it's also good business. After the law firms that refused to capitulate went public, they gained some clients from some of the law firms that did roll over from the beginning. Boy, I'm really picking on Columbia today. My apologies to the Columbia gods, but their student enrollment and their average test scores went down dramatically last year after they publicly caved to the Trump administration's beliefs. And I certainly know for my part, I'm far more interested in visiting a library or a museum that has made plain that they're there to accomplish their mission, right? To give us great art, to give us places of inquiry and learning, rather than someone who would, be a mouthpiece for federal propaganda, right? That is a different mission. So in addition to the kind of ethical and constitutional framework for collective action, there's also should be some self-interest. And we as consumers and members of civil society should exercise our preferences to really praise people, I think, that stand strong with their spines intact and find our ways to associate, communicate, spend our money with them, and let them know that that's not only the best way forward for our democracy, but it might be good for their business too. And I, to the last question that you asked, Ms. Goodman, I just also want to say that we are all here fighting for individual rights. And the First Amendment encompasses all kinds of expression, including that in dissent, of course, but also joy and music and creativity. And so I want to say to the frogs and the people like Ms. Kalb, who are comedy writers, that it is actually not just good or okay, it is necessary to fight for these rights with some personality and joy, because that is the expressive, messy democracy that we deserve and that we are fighting to get back to.
Thank you very much. And I'll turn to the I'll yield back and return to the ranking member to close us out with a couple questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. I got a couple of cases on my mind, and so I'd like to ask you lawyers or you non-lawyers to opine on the situation. All of these prosecutors and investigators over at DOJ have been fired because they worked on the January 6 cases. We've lost hundreds of people, very fine, top-notch lawyers, experienced senior lawyers, simply because the incoming administration disapproved of the fact that they worked on a case that they were assigned to. And I wonder if you would give me a First Amendment analysis of that. They're not being fired exactly for their speech because, of course, they weren't speaking. They were just doing their jobs. They accepted an order and they did their jobs, but their doing their job collided with the ideology of the incoming administration. And I just wonder if you would give us an analysis. Certainly the civil service law has been violated, but has the First Amendment also been violated by this? Ms. Rowland, perhaps you take a shot at that one.
I'm hesitant to give an honest answer because I don't love the Supreme Court's case law in this area.
Yeah.
Public employees have fairly constrained rights, and when they're speaking on behalf of their government employer, the First Amendment does not always cover their speech, and that's something I disagree with. But what the Supreme Court, in applying the boundaries of the First Amendment, has held is that where the government wields its power in ways that coerces people to self-censor or impacts private speech outside of the job, then absolutely that is cognizable under the First Amendment, as well it should be. So I'd like to see the protections, frankly, more robust there. But I think it is clear that where the government lends its power to punish and seek retribution for political enemies, whether those people are public servants or not, it should violate the law. And Ms. Kalb mentioned the executive order that Trump projected on day one, right, to follow it by penalizing a bunch of ideas, concepts, and words themselves in subsequent executive orders. But that the spirit that theoretically underlies that executive order is one that Congress could effectuate via law, which is not going to the Supreme Court to prove that they hold that the First Amendment, permits the government to basically jawbone and coerce private industry into doing its bidding, whether it's currying favor or acting out of fear. But Congress has the power to stop that and to ensure that the forces of the federal government are not wielded for retribution or for political favor or partisanship.
Or for the establishment of an official political viewpoint and impose it as an
Absolutely.
orthodoxy
Right.
on everybody.
And look,
Yep.
the First Amendment is a doctrine that is enforced by a court, right? And they're fundamentally political actors, just like
Yeah.
everybody in this room. But free expression is an idea. And I think much like, for example, Member Johnson, you were speaking about the threat of masked, highly armed agents, not only in communities, but potentially at the polls. It is the understatement of the year to say the drafters of the Constitution would roll over in their graves at that conception, whether or not, right, the Supreme Court would agree that that violates the First Amendment in any application. So where the First Amendment may not prevent that, and I wish it did, I hope that's a roadmap for those in Congress to find other solutions to uphold these norms in the future.
I often get letters or emails from people who, like Ms. Kalb, are not lawyers, who say, well, so-and-so, the president's lying about something. Why can't he just be stopped or sued or whatever? The Supreme Court, of course, has said that there's a right to lie under the First Amendment, at least when it comes to politics, maybe not in the commercial fraud sector. And, of course, Donald Trump has been convicted of fraud in dozens of counts of it, but he's been lying about who won the 2020 presidential election ever since it happened. Joe Biden beat him by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, and yet he continues to lie about it, and that lie has been embraced by MAGA and by the Republican Party, a bunch of our colleagues, alas. So they certainly believe that the First Amendment protects the right to lie. My question is, does the First Amendment still protect the right to tell the truth? So we have 6 colleagues who did ads on the social media simply saying, as veterans, they wanted to tell people in the armed services that they have not only a right, but a duty to disobey unlawful orders. And the Trump administration immediately attacked them. Donald Trump said it was sedition and punishable by death. And they've brought they attempted to bring a criminal indictment against them, and the great American invention of the U.S. grand jury stopped them because the grand jurors refused to indict any of our colleagues. But I wonder if you would just say a word, one of you opine about how the First Amendment is not only about the right to lie, which it certainly protects today, but also about the right to tell the truth in ways that are inconvenient because they collide with the views of people in power.
I can take that one just on the 6 members of Congress in particular and the speech rights of veterans that, again, were intended to be chilled by the actions taken against them, right? The administration wants veterans to believe that if they engage and speak out in ways that are critical of the administration, of its harms that it's doing to our national security, of the ways it's changing the practice of law in the military, of its disrespect to troops in uniform, that they can be punished with rank reductions or cuts to retirement benefits and maybe even prison time. Senator Kelly, as you may know, secured a preliminary injunction here in D.C. Vindicating the First Amendment rights there and saying that Secretary Hegseth does not have the ability to wield the Department of Defense against him for telling the truth. And that's really important, not only for high-ranking members of Congress, but because our political discourse is so impoverished. If we can't hear truth from the people who are most expert on these vital national security issues, we don't want them to be staying silent, as we know they are now, as a result of those kind of retaliatory actions.
All right, I got one final question, because before I left academia and became a washed-up loser law professor and a member of Congress, I taught First Amendment. I used to teach my students that the First Amendment's kind of like an apple, because everybody wants to take just one bite out of it. Somebody doesn't like racist speech. Somebody doesn't like anti-racist speech. Somebody doesn't like misogynistic speech. Somebody doesn't like feminist speech. Everybody's taking a bite, and then once everybody's taken their bite, guess what? There's nothing left at the end. So if you want to stand by the First Amendment, you've got to accept and tolerate the speech you abhor, as well as the speech that you agree with. Now, a lot of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are not present with us today have struck the pose of great free speech warriors during the Biden administration. Their big case that they talked about was when the social media companies, allegedly in league with the Biden administration, or rather the national security companies, notified the social media companies that, the national security agencies notified the social media companies that there was some disinformation afoot online. So if Vladimir Putin was putting out some propaganda online, giving the wrong date for an election, or if somebody was saying, injecting yourself with bleach is a cure for COVID-19, they would notify the social media companies and then allow them to take action. And this, our colleagues thought, was such an outrageous violation of the First Amendment that we had hearings after hearings about the fact that national security agencies were actually contacting the social media to alert them to the existence of disinformation online. Okay, that was the most extreme thing they could come up with because we talked about it for several years there. Now, compare that to shooting American citizens in the face for protesting against a federal government agency. Compare that to telling law firms and their lawyers that they will never be allowed to work in the federal government, get a federal contract, or enter a federal building, including a federal courthouse, because the president doesn't like one of the lawyers who worked at their firm. Or telling a university that the federal government is essentially going to take over their operations, curricular, admissions, faculty hiring, and so on, because they believe that the university's done something politically incorrect. I mean, you can't, those are two completely different worlds. You can't even compare those things. In fact, the Supreme Court, in I think the name of the case was Missouri versus Murphy, rejected the very claim that was being made by our colleagues and said there wasn't even standing to challenge it. But in any event, meantime, there are dozens of courts that have been finding the Trump administration in violation of the First Amendment free speech. But the question I want to ask you is about the question of First Amendment integrity and consistency for those of us in public life. How important is it, you think, for all of us to stand up for the First Amendment without regard to who is being censored and who's doing the censorship, without regard to which side is being hurt and which side is dictating the official orthodoxy? And how is it that we try to get people in public life to act with more consistency and more integrity when it comes to the freedom of expression? And I'm happy to open it up to any of you who want to take a shot at it.
Well, I'll wholeheartedly agree, and I appreciate you raising the idea of standing up for speech that you dislike or may even abhor. It takes no courage or principle at all to stand up for speech you agree with, right? That's just being a microphone or an amplifier. It's not a profile of courage. In fact, really the only principle... Well,
actually, I would say if the speech is being censored, you are at least identifying with someone who's a victim of censorship.
That actually in this moment is true. Yes, I take that. I take that point. Yeah. But as a general matter, it's not hard to want to stand up for that speech, right? You may be afraid because speech is demonized, but being a true free speech advocate is a rather bizarre thing, with apologies to my colleagues on the dais. A lot of people are rooting for one baseball team or the other, and you're rooting for the ref. And that's what civil liberties really are about. There's a word that when we talk about those rights, indivisible, right? And it's recognizing that when someone else's rights are eroded, yours are at risk too. And so I think that needs to be such a part of any public messaging that you and your colleagues have access to. And look, it's brutally unpopular at times, and you all are politicians. But I think there is an immense benefit to our ethics and, frankly, our constitutional democracy.
Well, I appreciate
recognize that across the spectrum of political beliefs. And it's really the only thing for me that keeps free speech alive, is when we all find that moment to reach out across the aisle. And it's one of the things I really appreciate about Jimmy Kimmel's return to air, that he took the time to give a monologue where he thanked people who disagreed with him first, because he recognized that principle. So anyone who can use their platform, their bully pulpit, to remind people that these principles, free speech, right, actually does have a cost to be principled in it. And sometimes that cost is standing in league with people you wildly disagree with, but you're all fighting for the right to be heard.
Yeah. And we're all coming to appreciate what the value of free speech is, because it's necessary to democracy and to creative self-expression, and also to a real search for the truth. So I appreciate that. And we're rooting for the ref as long as the ref is on the side of free speech. Sometimes the ref is also not on the side of free speech, and then we've got to stand for free speech and try to, as much as possible, defend that value wherever we can find it. Thank you very much, Ms. Scanlon, and thanks to all of our witnesses today for great testimony.
Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate today's discussion about efforts to silence dissent. We've certainly covered a lot of ground. We've got a whole catalog of attacks on the First Amendment, and it can be a little daunting. But I also appreciate the wisdom that everyone has brought to this, colleagues and panelists both, especially about the power of Americans and the pillars of our civil society to stand up, to take collective action, to reject self-censorship, and to speak the truth, to protect each other and to protect the First Amendment. So this will conclude our spotlight hearing. I want to thank everyone for appearing today.